Well, after the wars were over, the Greeks were expecting the Persians to return. However, the Persians never did. Instead, the Greeks wound up conquering Persia later. But they formed into two leagues, the Delian League. But not everybody liked the Delian League, so they formed another league called the Peloponnesian League. The Delian League was headed by Athens. The Peloponnesian League was headed by Sparta. Now, in the case of the Delian League, the people in the Delian League were told that you must supply money with Athens and we'll use that money to build up a huge navy that would be able to stand up against the Persians when they return. Instead, this money was used to beautify Athens, build up the big Parthenon, and build up all kinds of temples and build up all kinds of public squares. And hardly ever in the history of mankind has a city been able to beautify itself at the expense of other cities so easily. When a member of the Delian League said, "We've had enough of this," we went out, the Athenians said, "No, your hand is to stay, you can't get out." So the Delian League then was held together by Athens' firm hand. In the meantime, the Peloponnesian League grew to resent the Delian League, and ultimately, of course, this was to inevitably lead to war. All right, this takes us up to the last of the men of Athens I want you to remember. Now, folk, if you study Greek history, you'll learn there are a whole lot more people known. I mean, there was Cimon, there was Alcibiades, and my daughter took Greek history up at North Georgia, and she learned some of those names, but I'm not going to ask you to learn them. Anyway, Pericles was supposedly the greatest statesman that the greatest state that Athens had. And his era is called the Age of Pericles. It's sometimes called Classical Greece or called the Golden Age of Greece. The best time that Athens ever had was during the 30 years where he was ruler. Athens became more and more democratic under Pericles than ever, because Pericles seemed to be sincerely believing that democracy was the best way, and of course, under him, he kept getting reelected. Actually, he was elected 39 times in the 40 years. He was, 29 times in 30 years, all but one. One year he lost the election. But otherwise, he was elected over and over again. Well, your book says 15 times. All right, he was elected 15 times. Anyway, under Pericles, the Athenians were building up, and one day the Athenians decided we were going to build a wall. The people of Sparta said, "No, you shouldn't do this, and make you too powerful, upset the balance of powerful. You shouldn't build." So Pericles said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll come over to your city and talk to you about it. You might be right. We'd like to come to an agreement." So Pericles went to Sparta, but before he left Sparta, he told the people of Athens, "I want you to work day and night, man and woman, and every able-bodied person, work as much as you can, get these walls up, and when you get the wall finished, send for me." So Pericles stayed in Sparta for 2 weeks, talking to the Spartan officials about whether or not they should build a wall. Then all of a sudden, some messenger arrived from Athens. "Pericles, the wall is finished." Pericles said bye-bye to the Spartans and hurried home. And after a few days, the Spartans realized they'd been tricked when one of their men happened to see the wall and said, "Hey, Athens has finished its wall." And needless to say, the Spartans were extremely upset. Well, the Athenians got away too that with even the poor people could serve. At one time, only the rich could serve because it was felt that only the rich could spare the time off from their farms or from their businesses to take part in government. But the Athenians said even the poor people could serve. And a lot of the offices the Athenians had were offices that were picked by random. In other words, the name of every man was put like in a hat. And if you were picked, and you could be picked whether you were extremely rich or extremely poor, anywhere in between. If you were picked, you would serve as Archon for 1 year, then you would retire from the Archonship and serve on a council called the Areopagus, where former Archons served. They had another custom called ostracism that we might consider unusual till you realize what the purpose of it was. In most democratic societies, there are going to be two parties that are nearly even. One day this party might be ahead, then the next day this party might be ahead. So you might have a situation where the 3 or 4 men are running for office. One of them gets 51% of the vote, the other one gets 47% of the vote, and the other 2 men might get 2% of the vote, which 1% between them. Well, you can ignore the men who only get 1 or 2% of the vote, but the problem is this man who just almost won but barely lost, he might win tomorrow. He can say, well, I'm as powerful as you are. So what they did was they said the man who finishes second in an election must leave town for 10 years and not come back. He just stay, at least 30 or so miles out of town for 10 years. It's called ostracized. And that way the man who won the election then was more free to act when he didn't have his powerful opponent right on his coattails all the time, criticize every move he made and looking for a chance to pounce on him. So they would ostracize the person who finished second, or the one who was the highest loser. It makes sense when you understand it in a lot of small town democracies, or even in church politics. A lot of times you have 2 men who are almost equal in authority. They decide they want to get rid of one of them, so they would, so that the man who really was in charge could operate. All right, having said that, this takes us up to the Peloponnesian War. Again, the Peloponnesian League was Sparta to lead, but it's known to us as the Peloponnesian War because the Athenians were the ones who wrote the most about it. And it's like, when you're on a team, like the Braves will say, well, oh, it was that Mets game, or it was that game, that Pirates game, or whatever. In other words, you refer to the enemy, then name the war after the enemy you fought. All right, the Peloponnesian War started out, the first year you couldn't tell who was winning. Sparta had no significant navy, they were landlocked. Athens had a huge navy, and this gave them the advantage. They thought, well, maybe we can't beat the Spartan armies on land, but we can beat them in the water. Now, at the end of the first year of war, when nobody knew who'd win, Pericles got up and made a huge speech favoring democracy. Now, your book mentions that at the beginning of the chapter, and I'll mention it again here. I've already mentioned it once. But Pericles talked about how great and wonderful democracy was. Folk, I have to digress. I'm reminded here of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover got up in March 1929 and said, we're going to have 2 chickens in every American pot. There'll be 2 cars in every garage. We're going to see a time when the poorhouse will vanish from among our midst. Poverty is going to soon be wiped out off the American economic scene. He said it in March, October 29th. The country went into the biggest depression it ever had faced, and was to stay in that depression for 11 years. In the case of Pericles, after making his big speech defending democracy, shortly after the war resumed, and when it resumed, a plague struck the city of Athens. So the Spartan troops were outside the Athens walls, and the Athenians were locked up inside their walls, and a plague struck the city of Athens and carried off a high percentage of the Athenian population, including Pericles. Now I want to digress here for a minute or two to give you just one little glimpse into the personal life of Pericles. As a young man, Pericles had had an illegitimate child. Then he married and had 2 legitimate sons. Well, when the plague struck, a lot of men were losing their sons to the plague, and they would get up and they would say to the council of 500, let's let illegitimate sons inherit when there are no legitimate sons left. And Pericles staunchly said, no, illegitimate sons will not inherit an estate. Well, first his oldest son died. Then his youngest and last legitimate son died. He still had his illegitimate son alive. It was at the funeral of Pericles, who believed that a man should never cry, should keep what you call a stiff upper lip. He held his emotions until they got to a certain point of funeral, and all of a sudden he just lost control and just bawled uncontrollably out loud. crying. This just seemed to be very unbecoming of a leader of his stature. I mean, after all, folk, he was human, and after all, I still say there's no wrong in expressing emotions once in a while. You have to. Then he went before the Athenian council and asked the council if they would allow, I mean, he reversed himself, if they would allow his illegitimate son to inherit his estate. The council turned him down. They said, hey, what are you doing? You've always been against before. How come all of a sudden you want your illegitimate son to inherit your estate? Shortly after that, Pericles himself died, also the place. I don't know who got his estate. But anyway, the golden age of Pericles had come to an end. Athenian hegemony also came to an end. Now, the Peloponnesian War lasted 20 years. There have been many books written by it, and Attila the Roman later was to write about it. The fortunes of war would sometimes go back and forth. The Athenians did get a fairly great leader once who led them to a few victories, but then they would blow their victories after they had gotten them. Make long story short, after 20 years, Sparta soundly defeated Athens, tore the city largely down, tore down the walls, and told the Athenians they must sink and burn and sink all their ships to guarantee that Athens would never rise again, supposedly. And Athens was subjugated. Well, while this was going on, the Spartan helots, the slaves, revolted at one point, and actually Athens and Sparta quit their quarrels while Athens went to help Sparta put down its slave uprising. I mean, you know, this is the way wars sometimes go. Just like in our case, we might find ourselves fighting side by side with Iranians. Who knows in the next few days? I mean, you know, just sometimes you change enemies, you change friends. All right. Now, you might think, folk, at this point that Sparta is going to become the chief state of the Greeks. It might have happened, except for a few things that went wrong, which I will get to in a little bit. But